like a big party or something like that, in which everyone is having the time of their life, and it's celebration and it's joy and it's wonderful, and yet at the same time, there's someone, and it could have been you, but there's someone in there who's just having the absolute worst night of their life for whatever reason. You guys ever been in a situation like that, where at a party or at something like that, there's such an atmosphere of celebration, and yet at the same time, there's almost this intruder, this foreign presence, this thief that has come and is attacking one person or one small contingent of the group within that, and they're just having an awful time. I used to be the medic on a lot of different Christian camps that I went on. I was trained, I still am trained, in a lot of different first aid stuff. So being one of the few that was, I used to have to be kind of the camp nurse or the whatever that needed to happen, medically speaking. And so often I would be sitting with a young person on camp, and they're just like sick as a dog, or they've been injured in some terrible way, and so they're just in the worst mood. And you can hear like celebration going on. I'm in the infirmary, or I've been in the ER before with a kid, and I know that what's going on back at the campsite is just they're having a party, they're having a great time, and yet at the same time there's this juxtapositioning of celebration and pain. And for some reason, it just makes it seem so much worse. Pain is with us in our life, but when the atmosphere should be one of praise and joy and happiness, to know that at that same moment, there's a person going through terrible pain, it just feels wrong, worse than it should be. It feels evil. You feel the brokenness of the word, that pain and sin and evil is truly an intruder, ruining this perfect, holy, sanctified moment which is supposed to be going on in the lives of this community. And when I read the story of birth of Jesus Christ, I get that same sense that there's just this real sense of joy and jubilation and wonder going on. You come to a place in the story, you see pain, you see turmoil, you see ugliness. And it just seems so foreign, it seems so out of place in the midst of that story. And it jars my heart so much. And when we think about the Christmas story, there's a part that we leave out pretty often. There's a big part that we leave out that because we don't really know how to deal with it. A couple of years ago, I went to this beautiful display of the Christmas story, the nativity scene called Walk to Bethlehem. It's part of our Hudson Baptist Church. We've got two of the main actors in the back of the room back there. I actually went to see them because they used to be one of my youth kids. So I went to go see them. What it basically is this sort of station by station, a reenactment by all these dressed volunteers, dressed in the garb of sort of first century Judaism. And they're reenacting different parts of the nativity story, the birth of Christ. And you go from station to station. It's beautiful, it's wonderful. It's also really cold, so it's all outdoors. And I don't think they didn't do this yet, did they? It's sad. Anyway, but they left this part out of the story, and I kind of get why. Okay, because if they had put this part of the story, it would have been really traumatic. All right. What we're talking about tonight is a part of, we find it in Matthew chapter 2. And it's essentially the part of the story in which Jesus Christ and Joseph and Mary have to run for their lives. Herod is after them, and we see a massacre of children. So it's really jarring, it's really uncomfortable, it's difficult to digest. It confronts our soft, tender view of the Christmas story. And to be honest, I very rarely have heard anyone preach about this passage, and I understand why. It's difficult to preach about. It's difficult to know how to handle this part of the story and what was going on and why it's part of the story at all. Matthew chapter 2. We start in verse 7 and we'll read up until verse 23. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. When coming to the house, they saw the child and his mother Mary. They bowed down and worshipped him. And they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their countryside by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. He gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. When he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. And so was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. Let's pray together. Lord, for this difficult passage, we ask for your help. Lord, we ask that you might illuminate our search through the scriptures tonight. That you might reveal to us what is going on, how we are to better understand you and the gospel through this passage. We mourn with those who mourn the loss of children in this world. We long for the day when it will be over, God. We thank you for the hope that you provide. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. The story has taken a turn. We've gone from angels' announcements and beautiful gifts and wonder and awe to the massacre of children. It's ugly. It's horrible. It's so severe that this part of the story actually draws the doubt of many skeptics. They say that this couldn't be true. That if this had happened, if Herod had really done this, then there would have been more evidence of it. We would have found other people outside of the Gospels who give an account of this happening. I don't think that's a valid criticism. When we understand what happened, it's actually quite in line with what Herod would have done on a fairly normal day for him. To give you a little bit of context, they speculate that given sort of census and what the population of Bethlehem would have been around that time in history, this would have been around between 12 to 20 young boys who would have been killed in this. And what we know of Herod is that he was more than capable of doing something like this, and then doing it without batting an eye. He was typical of powerful men in that as they gain power, they usually do so by becoming very cunning, and they become very vengeful in the process too. And that is exactly what Herod was. He was cunning, and he was vengeful. His wrath was immediate, and it was out of proportion. like other people who hold power and like to hold power, he hated surprises. He hated not feeling like he was in control. And this news that the Magi brought to Herod was definitely a surprise, something that he was not expecting in any way. And because of that, it threatens his sense of control, and he will do all he can to crush that and to control the situation again. Herod had, from what we understand from the history books, become increasingly more and more paranoid as he rose in power in order to protect the power that he had and hold on to it. He was cunning, but he was evil. He has killed family members in the past, including his own wife, because he suspected them of undermining his authority and trying to usurp his throne. He made a decree that on the day that he died, other leading men in the surrounding region would be killed too, in order to ensure that the mourning of his loss would be great. This is an evil man. This is a man who is paranoid, who is vengeful. And so this type of man is more than capable of doing something like this without batting an eye. All of these terrible things he did out of paranoia, a sense of losing control, a sense of being threatened by something outside that's going to take away the grip that he has. But when he sees Jesus Christ as a threat, we have to say that he wasn't wrong. Jesus Christ was a threat to Herod. Now, obviously, his actions are pure evil. He was right in seeing that Jesus Christ was a threat. Jesus Christ did threaten Herod's power. He did threaten the power that he had, just as all the power structures in this world that set themselves up against the will of God are threatened by Jesus Christ. He was right to be threatened. The only reason that Jesus Christ didn't draw more attention to him is because he was born in some backwater town, some nowheresville in the far forgotten region of the Roman Empire, this annoying little province they didn't care much about, that he was born to peasant parents with no real sway at all. And so he went completely under the radar of the rest of the world powers. They had no idea who he was, what was going on. And yet we will see, 33 years after this point, the Romans do see that he is a threat. He will be crucified by the Romans. They crucify him because they see him as a rebel. They see him as an upstart that's going to threaten the control that Rome has over that region. And you know what? Their instinct is right too. Though they don't understand how he is a threat, they misinterpret that. They see that he is a threat. And you know what happens? Even though they seek to crush him, his followers will radically change the face of the world and radically change Rome. They were right to be scared. The power structures of this world are right to be scared. Jesus Christ is a real threat to them. We live in a world where that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Well, generally speaking, culture sees religion today as something that only really affects someone's private life, has real no sway in the social sphere. Perhaps more so in America than here. Canada sees, there's not much power to religion anymore. It's not really going to affect society in any big way. It's kind of past its heyday. It was very different in that world back then. Religion was at the very center of life. And that meant that if you were a religious leader, you had tremendous power too. You held the sway of the people. Religious ideas shaped empires. Religious leaders drove huge momentous change in that time. So to be a religious leader meant that you did have power. And we see throughout the ministry of Jesus Christ, people continually recognize that he is a threat to the power structures. We see that the demons know who he is. They call out to him. They beg him to stay away. They beg him to show mercy. They are terrified by him. Why? Because he is a threat. He is a threat to the work that they are doing in the world. He is a threat to the power that they hold over people as well. Okay. The Pharisees too recognize that Jesus Christ is a threat. They plot to kill him. They try to undermine him. Why? Because they know that what he is preaching is different to what they're preaching. And if people follow him, they're not going to follow us. And if people don't follow us, then our power is lost. They understand he's a threat. And in light of that threat, they seek to undermine it. They seek to destroy him and discredit him and to kill him. Jesus Christ is a threat to this world. He is a threat to anything that stands opposed to the will of God in this world, including any power structure that holds itself against the will of God. I love that quote. It's very widely used, but in the Chronicles of Narnia, I think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe way, the children are about to meet this Christ figure, Aslan, who's a lion, right? And one of the children, I think it's Lucy, asks, they just find out he's a lion. They didn't know he was going to be a lion. And so Lucy asked, is he safe? And Mr. Beaver answers, no, he's not safe, but he's good. That's true of Christ. He's not safe. He's not safe to be around, but he's good. And when we look at the threat that Jesus Christ poses to the world and the world structures, the power structures in the world around us, he poses the same threat to the status quo and the power structures that we find within our own lives too. That when Jesus Christ is invited into our lives, he threatens the status quo that we become comfortable. He threatens where we find our security, where we find our comfort. See, there are areas of my life that are not under God's control. Areas of my life which I still exhibit laziness, where I enjoy particular TV shows and media and doing things with my time that dishonor God, where I continue to spend my money on things I shouldn't really. There are better uses for the money God has given me, where I speak in such a way that God would not be honored with. These are things that I'm comfortable with. These are things that I feel in control of, that I like to be in control of. I like the status quo. And inviting Jesus Christ into my life truly presents a threat to that way of living, presents a threat to that status quo. Because he is going to come in, and if I allow him in truly, he's going to change things. He's going to break things and mold them more and more into his own image. And when I see that coming, I do exactly what Herod did. I resist. I push back against, I respond with anger and violence and rejection. I push his rule away. I seek to once again control my life and hold on to it, not relinquishing control. And what this story should teach us is that to resist what God is doing in this world is absolutely foolish. What Herod should have done is submit. What Herod should have done is to recognize that a greater power was at work in the world, that he was to bow down to it and say, your will be done. But instead he pushes back. Instead he rails against that power. You know what? I find something interesting in this story. We look, and it's very obvious as we read the story, that Herod is threatened by Jesus Christ. He wouldn't have reacted this way unless he was threatened. He felt the threat that Jesus Christ was to him. But when we flip it around, can we say that Jesus Christ truly was threatened by Herod? I don't think so. We can't. No, Jesus Christ was never at risk from Herod. We see that every attempt that Herod has to try and control the situation once again, to try and bring it back under, to try to, order the world the way he wants it to be ordered and to crush this threat, is completely thwarted by God, completely and utterly thwarted by him. He attempts to trick the wise men and the Magi into giving him information so that he might go and kill Jesus. They just warn in a dream and they just go right around him. Then he attempts to kill Christ, but again, God intervenes miraculously and brings them out of the situation. And then he dies. completely unable. Jesus Christ remains completely out of his reach. He dies, and then Jesus comes back. The ministry continues. You know, we, like Herod, try to control the world around us, believe that we have some semblance of power to order our life the way that we want it to be ordered, to impress our will upon the world around us. And yet what this story teaches me is that we are not the ones who shape this world. We are not the ones who have any real power in this world. And if we attempt to resist God, we are doing something so foolish at the end of the day. This story reminds me that God is the one who is in control over all of this. Not only do we see that God is completely able to just keep Herod at bay, just move pieces around, but that this he knew was going to happen all along. That even in Herod trying his best to undermine and destroy the threat of Jesus Christ, he not only completely fails, but in doing so is actually legitimizing the very fact that Jesus Christ is king, because through Herod's actions, prophecies are being fulfilled. Prophecies that are going to much more strengthen the claim that Jesus Christ has to messiahship. He is undermining his own authority in his very attempt to overreach his power. God is the one of unstoppable power, of endless resource, of limitless intelligence. To me, through this story, what I see is a picture of an unstoppable God, of a God whose will cannot be thwarted, cannot be undone. One of the prophecies that is fulfilled, we see Matthew alluding to it, the original verse found in Hosea 11, verse 1, "Out of Egypt I call my son." This is in the Old Testament, talking originally about Israel and how Israel was brought up out of Egypt. And it's an allusion to this beautiful idea which we find throughout the New Testament, particularly in the book of Matthew, how Jesus Christ is really taking upon himself the story of Israel and retelling the story of Israel prophetically and symbolically in his life. Just as Israel was called out of Egypt, so Christ is called out of Egypt. Just as Israel went through 40 years in the wilderness, tested and trials came, the same way Jesus Christ is taken for 40 days into the desert and experiences his testing and trial, and in so many other ways. Jesus Christ is a new Israel, is the true Israel, and he's taking upon some of those stories, so we see this in his life. And part of the story should seem very familiar to us. When we think of another story in the Bible that involves a Hebrew boy in Egypt, infanticide, a tyrant trying to kill young boys, and yet a boy being spared out of that by God's divine promise and power. Who should this remind us of? Moses. Oh, good job. It's the story of Moses. And this is one sign, and one of many signs, that we'll see that Jesus Christ is a type of Moses. Well, more Moses was a type of Jesus, but what was the point of Moses? What was the point of the whole Exodus? Moses and God leading the people out of bondage, establishing a new covenant with them, an exodus into a new day, out of slavery into freedom, into a new covenant with God. We read the Exodus story, what we should see, and the whole point of the Exodus story is to reveal, one, a God who redeems, and two, a God who is unstoppable, completely unstoppable. And that is what's being alluded to here in this passage too. We find an unstoppable God, once again, who is retelling the story of the Exodus, bringing it back to mind so we know what is going on in the world. We like to think that the world is ordered a certain way, that we understand what comes next, that there's a logic that we can grasp hold of, there's a predictability to what's going to go on next, and so we can see it, we can react, we can control it. But what we see is that God is the one who breaks up all of our conceptions. God is the one who is able to thwart all of our plans in order to make his will be done. God comes in, and despite all of our predictions, despite all of our assumptions, despite all of our efforts, shows that we have no real power here. and that he cannot be stopped. This world does not threaten him. Nothing in this world threatens him. This truth is what allows Christians to act differently. This truth is what allows us to see the world differently, because we know that despite what's going on in the world around us, God is in control. And we can trust him because of his control and because of his love. He is trustworthy. You know what dawned on me as I read this passage once again? That Jesus lived a completely intentional life. Think about that for a minute. His life, all of the suffering that he took upon himself, all of those less than ideal parts of his life were completely intentional. N.T. Wright said this about this part of this passage. He says, "Banish all thoughts of a peaceful Christmas scene. Before the Prince of Peace had learned to walk and talk, he was a homeless refugee with a price on his head." This is the life that Jesus chose. He willingly accepted this life of a refugee, this life of uncertainty. Even when he comes back, as we see as part of the story, he comes back and settles in the land of Galilee, in Nazareth. So he's been called a Nazarene. That is actually a stigma that throughout the rest of his ministry, you're going to see that people look down on him because he's from Galilee, because he's a Nazarene. They laugh at him, they mock him and scorn him. That part of the region of the world was considered by the rest of the Israelite nation to be like this kind of like, I don't know, the inferior people, these hicks, these country bumpkins. And he takes that stigma upon himself. It's something he does on purpose. All of the difficulty he endures, all of the suffering that he brings into his life, it's all on purpose. Why? He could have lived a cushy life. He could have been born into a palace. He could have been born completely removed from pain and difficulty as he grew up. Why did he choose to do it? Because he is Emmanuel. Because he is God with us. And if he is God with us, and this is a world of pain and struggle, then he is God with us in the pain and in the struggle. Because he wants us to know that he understands and he relates and he empathizes with us. He takes the world's pain as his own. And what's beautiful about that is that because of the intentionality of Jesus Christ's suffering, and because of the way that we see he overcomes all of it, he shows us that there is no pain, no suffering in this world that can overcome the will of God. That pain will not have the last word. God will have the last word. Because he is a God that suffers redemptively. He suffers with a purpose and can radically transform it. We can see that though we may have pain in our life, that in God's hands, that very thing that we were sure was going to destroy us is the very thing that God is going to use to make us into the image of Christ. Amen. It's going to bring redemption about in our life. Again and again, what we see in the life of Jesus Christ is that powers will rail against him, causing him suffering, causing him strife and anguish, and he will overcome all of them. They have no power over him. This story is an agonizing story. It's difficult to swallow. We cannot soften the tragedy of innocent children being killed. And I think that's part of the point. The Bible saying that it fulfills prophecy is not in any way trying to soften what it is and trying to bring a silver lining to the situation. What it's trying to say is that the most awful, awful things in this world still cannot stop the will of God. Cannot usurp what God is doing in this world. You will experience some of the worst things in this world, but do not think that through them God is going to be surprised. God is going to be unprepared. God is going to be blocked by these things in your life. And the wonderful, wonderful picture we have of this above all is the cross and the resurrection. The cross and the resurrection stands against a world of violence. We live in a world still today where children are killed to protect the power of tyrants. We live in a world today of suffering and of death and of evil. And the message of the cross is this, that those powers threw their very worst at Jesus Christ. They came against him and they did the very worst thing that they could possibly do, tortured and killed him. And it was not enough to stop him. It was not enough to stop the redemptive work of God. That even though through all the pain, all the suffering and the torture that he endured, he overcame. It was actually the very thing that made him our Savior and our Redeemer. He flipped it on the head of the world. The message of the cross is that the world can do its very worst to stop God, and it is not enough. It is not enough to stop God. The message of the cross is that he exposes the true weakness of the powers in this world, the limit of their power, and shows them to be utterly impotent and weak. That nothing in this world can stand against the work of redemption that God has. And that has been the history of the church too. Since the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ, he has left with us the kingdom to spread. And what he has promised is that nothing will stop his kingdom advance. Not even the gates of hell themselves will be able to stop the spread of the church. And we have seen through church history that government after government, tyrant after tyrant have railed against the church, seeking to destroy it. And always it has prevailed. Always Christianity has lived on. The gospel has continued to go forward in this world. We have a reminder in this passage, a guarantee that God's plan cannot be thwarted by this world. The evil in this world is impotent in trying to usurp and upset the plan of God. And the same is true for your life too. No matter what comes in your life, be of great assurance that it cannot stop what God is doing in your life. It will not usurp what he is doing in your life. We have a guarantee that God will have the final word, that justice and peace will reign eternally. That God will have the final word. And because of this, we can be afforded two things. The first thing is that we can afford to be very patient. And the second is that we can afford to be very bold. We can be patient because we see a world around us that is still broken, still full of evil, and yet we know that God has not given up on it, and God cannot be stopped by it. So we continue to be patient, to love with long, long suffering, because we know that God still loves this world. God is so active in this world. God has not abandoned this world. And so we continue to be patient, not give up on this world, not contract inwardly and think there's no hope, because we see that there is. God will have the last word. And we can be bold because we know that they threw the very worst that they had against Jesus Christ, and it did not stop him. In the same way, it will not stop the advancement of his church. It will not stop what he is able to achieve in this world today. We can be bold because the very worst of this world cannot topple what God is doing in the world around us today. This is the comfort that I draw from the story. It is a message of power. We see in it a power struggle in which God is always on top, always able to overcome. And we see that it is utterly foolish in our lives too, to try and maintain the power that we hope to have over our lives, not relinquishing control over to him, thinking that somehow that's good or wise or can last in the light of eternity. We are fools for trying. We must give over our lives to him. We must give over our thoughts, our speech, our love, our purity over to him. Because by that, we hope to achieve something that is in line with the will of God. We hope to achieve something that will last eternally. We hope to not set ourselves up against God who cannot be stopped. We see that this is a God that cannot be stopped. And as we enter now into the Christmas story and then into the new year with all its sort of promise of hope, we know still this world is not as it should be, as I am not as I should be. But God is still at work, and he's still moving in amazing, wonderful ways, and he cannot be stopped. Mm-hmm. Let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for your power. We thank you for the guarantee that you have given us that you cannot be stopped. We thank you for the wonderful truth that we find in Scripture, that though this world may rail and rail against you, you will have the final word. Help us to be patient. Help us to be bold. Help us to be those who look inwardly and relinquish control over to you, humbly submit our lives to you. Help us not to be fools, Lord. Help us instead to see what you are doing in this world, to see that it is the only thing that will last, to hold on to that hope that you have given us. We praise you, Lord. We thank you so much. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.